What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back again with the Awesemo team, talking some college football DFS, the Week 8 main slate. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. Today, we will be bringing you behind the glass, showing you all the tools we have to offer, mainly the player usage data we have, but we also have ownership projections, regular projections, slate write-ups, everything you need to dominate college football DFS. And without further ado, let's dive right into this. We are going to kick this off with the Cincinnati Navy game, a really interesting slate of games here. There's a lot of teams on bye, so it's not the best slate that we've seen this year, but we're going to kick this off. Cincinnati is a 27.5-point favorite in a game with a 49-point total. Navy running the triple option is implied for just 10 points. Cincinnati, we saw Desmond Ridder last week fall victim to game script. They were in an absolute blowout situation, so they did not need to use Ridder. Jerome Ford's the one that ends up with a multi-touchdown game. That could swing Ridder's direction, but he hasn't shown much upside this year, just 118 yards as a rusher. He's formerly been above 550 in the last 3 years, but he's just not running the ball as much as they continue to handle opponents. Passing yards way down to just 28 attempts per game. The implied team total gives him a ceiling, but we just haven't really seen it. He hasn't hit 300 yards once this year. So Ridder, a little bit expensive on this slate, but certainly in play for tournaments. Ford's coming off the monster game, so he now has 18.2 touches per game. He's averaging 116 yards. Game script projects to be in his favor, but he's now expensive at 8,300. Certainly playable at that price, but just a little bit tougher to get to. In the receiving game, it's the same issues that we see with Ridder. Alec Pierce is just too expensive at 6,700 for his 5.3 targets and 66 yards per game. Michael Young is much cheaper, but he's only averaging 30 yards per game on 4 targets. They just don't throw the ball a lot. They're already a low-volume offense, 65 plays per game, and then just 4 touchdown favorites. You shouldn't see a lot of passing volume here. So Cincinnati, even with the high implied team total, just tournament viable, in my opinion. Navy runs the triple option. Ty Lavatai is the quarterback. They typically use the quarterback as the leading rusher for Navy, but Lavatai hasn't had 100 rushing yards yet this year, and triple option quarterbacks need to be treated like running backs. If you play one of them, you're basically just taking an opportunity cost play where you can't play a second quarterback if you play Lavatai, so it's not really worth getting to outside of tournaments. Isaac Ruos is the fullback. He will cede a little bit of play to James Harris. Ruos averages 13.3 touches per game. Against Cincinnati's elite defense, just not worth targeting. Chance Warren, Carlinos AC are the slot backs, also not worth getting to here. And you never play receivers from triple option teams. Navy is a pass. Oklahoma taking on Kansas for game number 2, a 38-point spread, giving Oklahoma a 53-point implied team total. This is a rare situation where we have to actually factor in blowouts. How much does Caleb Williams play? How much do the starters get? On the way there, they should be just fine, though. So we could find some ceiling games from Oklahoma. 67.5-point total overall. Kansas's defense is brutal. Caleb Williams has been a phenomenal quarterback replacing Spencer Rattler this year. He's very mobile, has at least 66 yards or a score in the last 2 games. And he's been efficient as a passer. Last week, 78% completion percentage, 295 yards. Kansas plays horrific defense. Caleb Williams firmly in play. Kennedy Brooks has firmly usurped Eric Gray as the lead running back, 25 and 20 carries in back-to-back games. Brooks has just run laps around Gray in terms of efficiency, which makes sense. Gray is still in play in this game because of the blowout potential. He is much, much cheaper than Brooks, but both are viable. After Marvin Mims blew up in their second most recent game, he went back down to running a run on 50% of dropbacks last week. Lincoln Riley just maybe not as smart as we thought with his player personnel. So Marvin Mims, very risky at 7,300. He's averaging just 3.5 targets per game. Not something you can play with consistency. He'd have to get there on volume. Jaden Hazelwood is actually the most used receiver on the field. 5.7 targets per game for Hazelwood. He's cheaper than Mims, and he'd be the preferred play. The rest of the receivers are just purely rotating. For Kansas, Jason Bean got benched in last week's game. He just doesn't have a leash right now. He's very mobile, but Oklahoma's defense is good, and Kansas just has no efficiency. You're not playing anyone in the run game. Devin Neal's moved ahead of Amari Pesic-Hickson and Torrey Lachlan, but just really tough matchup. And then Trevor Wilson and Kwame Lassiter are the 2 receivers here. Lassiter is running more routes, but just hasn't been any efficiency. Kansas is a pass, just like Navy. Illinois taking on Penn State. Illinois, 11-point implied team total. They are 24-point underdogs to the Nittany Lions that might be without their starting quarterback. 46-point total overall. Brandon Peters was cleared to practice. Doesn't matter. Sitkowski and Peters, neither of whom are efficient. The leader, Sitkowski, is completing just 52% of his passes. You can't play anyone in Illinois. The run game, it is somewhat condensed between Chase Brown and Josh McCray, but in games they're down, you see they're just going to fall victim to negative game script and cannibalize each other. Neither are strong plays against a good Penn State defense. And because we're not playing Sitkowski and Peters, the Illinois receiving room is also a disaster. You have Isaiah Williams averaging 7.7 targets per game, but just 43 yards. Casey Washington's the wide receiver too, but he only has 108 yards in the season. You're not playing anyone in Illinois. Penn State would be a normal target, but they do not have a starting quarterback right now. They're implied for 35 points. Sean Clifford is questionable for this game with an injury, and just based on opponent, I wouldn't be surprised to see him out. And you could see him pulled early in the game if Illinois just cannot put up a fight here. So Clifford's very, very risky despite the upside. He's a good dual threat, benefits from high volume, 247 yards on 30 attempts per game. And then there's just not a clear backup behind him. Taquan Roberson was splitting first-team reps early in the week with Christian Velo. You could see both of them play if Clifford is out. Roberson is efficient on the ground. He's a good dual threat, but there's just no clarity with Penn State's starting quarterback right now. This is a situation to monitor late in the week in case you can find some value, but Penn State's really banged up right now. And it's telling that they're still 24-point favorites. In the run game, John Lovett and Devin Ford went down with injuries in last week's game. That does reduce the backfield to a two-way committee. Both Lovett and Ford are questionable. Not sure if we'll see them play, but Noah Kane and Kevon Lee could be in line for elevated opportunities. We actually outcarried Kane 10-8 in last week's game. Could be in line for just elevated volume because of game script here. And if this is a two-way timeshare, would have a lot of interest in both Kane and Lee. Just something you'll have to wait on late in the week. Lovett and Devin Ford, again, questionable with injuries. In the receiving game, Jahan Dotson is still just a pure alpha receiver, averaging 12 targets per game over their last 4 contests. Again, we don't project to see the same volume here, but he's been very efficient as well, 82 yards per game. As far as pay-up option goes, Dotson's been fairly consistent, just worried a little bit about volume. That makes Parker Washington and Keandre Lambert-Smith also a little bit expensive. Their volume's been propped up in recent weeks by competitive games, which we do not project to see here. And you also have to factor in the potential that Taquan Roberson and Christian Velo play quarterback, and maybe we get some reduced efficiency. So even with a 35-point implied team total, Penn State's very risky right now. It is a team to monitor. If you get some players healthy and in the running back room, some players out, could be worth looking GPPs. Northwestern taking on Michigan. Northwestern, again, implied for just 14.5 points. We've got a lot of projected blows on the slate. Michigan is a 21.5-point favorite. This is moving quickly up to 24. This was done on Monday, these lines. The overall total, 50.5 points, sits heavily in Michigan's favor. Northwestern has been forced to play fast and pass heavy because they've been down in games. They sit at 3-3 overall. Ryan Helinski has actually benefited a lot from this volume in recent weeks as the starter. He's played fairly well, completed 57.5% of his passes for 6.5 yards per attempt. Surprisingly, over 250 yards in each of Northwestern's last 2 games, but Michigan's defense is far better than what they've faced in recent weeks. In the backfield, Evan Hall will split time with Andrew Clare, the Bowling Green transfer. Hall is averaging 95.5 rushing yards per game on 18 touches, also somewhat active in the pass game. You're just going up against a really tough Michigan defense, so 6,200 is too much for him. Clare in a change of pace role is not something I'm looking at either. In the receiving game, Bryce Kurtz got hurt last week, so now he was out. So now you have some concentration between Stephon Robinson, 5,500, and Malik Washington, 3,900. Washington popped up for 7 targets, so he was very clearly the wide receiver too. Robinson has 22 targets combined in the last 2 games, so maybe as run backs, but again, not a great game environment overall, so I'm not sure how much you want of Robinson at his elevated price. The wide receiver 3 was a timeshare. They used 2 tight ends a lot, which isn't something you want to see, but J.J. Jefferson was technically that player, the wide receiver 3 targets for him. Really cheap, but I think you just go up and play Washington at 500 more. On Michigan, very, very run heavy. They're passing just 33% of the time, very slow. Cade McNamara needs competitive games to see elevated attempts, which does not project to be the case here. He did see that against Nebraska, but that's the only time he's been above 250 yards this year. He hasn't reached 200 yards in any other game. They're going to use Blake Corum and Hassan Haskins to try to pound the ball against Northwestern, a pretty bad run defense, allowing 244 rush yards per game. So Corum actually took a little bit of a backseat to Hassan Haskins in the last 2 games. Haskins has outcarried him in both, but Corum is still the preferred pass catching back. Corum has the edge in touches on Haskins on the year. Corum is averaging 18.8 to Haskins 17.3. And Corum has just been more efficient, averaging 102 rushing yards to Haskins 82 on fewer attempts. So Corum would be the preferred play if you're playing one of these Michigan backs. I think both are viable in GPPs. In the receiving room, Cornelius Johnson and Dalen Baldwin are the wide receiver 1 and 2. Both have seen more lately, but again, on the year, Cornelius Johnson, 4 targets per game, Dalen Baldwin, 3.5. Their elevated target opportunities, Cornelius Johnson had 7 in their last game, Baldwin at 13. That came because of game script, which we do not project to have the same here. Eric All's the tight end, just 16 targets on the year for him, not worth targeting. In this game, focusing on the Michigan running backs or just moving on. Next game, we have Wake Forest taking on Army, our second triple option team on the slate. Wake Forest only 3.5-point favorites here, 52-point total. Army getting some respect, but Wake Forest is one of the most sensitive teams in terms of game script that we have. They're going to be very fast, 79 plays per game, but they will be pass heavy in competitive situations, run heavy when playing from ahead. That makes Sam Hartman very risky, even though he has some mobility himself. We've seen him very few pass attempts in certain games, and if they get ahead against Army, that is the major worry. If you're stacking him, Jacare Roberson should not be cheaper than A.T. Perry. He's averaging more targets on the year. He's averaging more receiving yards. A.T. Perry is the clear wide receiver 2, but if you're just picking 1 for 1 here, it's Roberson. The wide receiver 3 is Taylor Morin. He was out-targeted by Donald Stewart last week, but Morin over 80% of the routes, Donald Stewart 22%. Morin is still the wide receiver 3. In the backfield, they'll use 3 backs unless games are hyper-competitive. Then you will see Christian Beal-Smith pull ahead. That is what happened last week. 17 carries for Beal-Smith to 6 for Turner and 4 for Ellison. Beal-Smith's only 5K, which is worth a look here. Army's played solid run defense overall, but we just saw Braylon Allen for Wisconsin eclipse 100 yards on 16 carries. So better teams can have their way with Army. It will be Christian Beal-Smith or bust here. Then we have Army, triple option Army. Christian Anderson, their starter, has been hurt. He's questionable for this game. I do not think it makes a ton of difference. Tahir Tyler has stepped in for him, handled a decent opportunity share, and Wake Forest has struggled a little bit on defense in terms of their run game, allowing 180 yards per game. But Army's triple option threat is just a little bit different here. And again, it's the same thing like with Navy. Are you going to pay 7K plus for a glorified running back here? The answer for me is no. In the true run game, Jacoby Buchanan, he's the fullback, will split time with Anthony Aikens a little bit here. They rotate their slot backs between Tyrell Robinson, A.J. Howard, Brandon Walters, Raheem Murphy. None of them are good plays. And of course, not playing any Army pass catchers. The leader in targets, Isaiah Alston, has just 8. Kansas State taking on Texas Tech, a pick'em game, 60.5-point total overall, which is rich for typical Kansas State games. But Texas Tech has their defensive weaknesses. They play fairly fast and pass heavy. So it's an interesting spot to target. Kansas State has been beatable as well, particularly through the air. And looking to Kansas State first, very slow team. They are running the fewest plays per game in the entire country. Skylar Thompson is a strong dual threat. Haven't seen it much this year. He's been banged up, so he hasn't played a full complement of snaps. But he has some upside as a rusher, and he would really need to utilize that to hit a ceiling performance here. He's not a strong option overall, just due to limited play volume against Texas Tech. Deuce Vaughn has a fantastic role here and is the preferred Kansas State play if getting to 1. Cheaper on DraftKings. He's extremely active with 23.3 opportunities per game and a ton of that coming as a pass catcher. He leads the team with a 24% target share. So Vaughn is viable in all game scripts. He's a solid contrarian pay-up option, and there's a lot of constructions where he makes sense. In the receiving room, Malik Knowles is the wide receiver 1, but paying $5,600 for a Kansas State receiver is just a little bit baffling. He's only averaging 36 receiving yards per game. Phillip Brooks is at 46.5, but he's been targeted less than Malik Knowles in recent weeks, so his role has declined. None are worth mentioning here. Texas Tech. Henry Columbi is their signal caller here, somewhat mobile. He's played well at times this year, a little bit up and down, but if you look to some of his games, he can run, and he has 2 games above 300 yards already. And remember, Tyler Show started the year. He's out with a collarbone injury. Columbi is completing 65.5% of his passes for 9 yards per attempt. Kansas State depresses play volume overall, but we've seen them allow a lot of production at times. So he is a GPP option worth considering. I think he's a better play straight up than Thompson on the other side. The running backs are a little bit tough to decipher. Taj Brooks has been out, and he's still somebody to monitor because he was the lead back prior to injury. But SaRodorick Thompson was injured for most of that time, and now he's reemerged as the lead back here, but he will split time and cede carries to Xavier White. It is not the bell cow role we saw at times from him down the stretch. And Kansas State fairly strong against ground attacks. They're a little bit weaker through the air. So SaRodorick, unless they get up in games, he's just a GPP play. In the receiving game, Eric Ezukama and Kalen Geiger are the 1 and 2. Everybody else is rotating. So these are the two guys you really want to get to. Ezukama being just 600 more on both platforms. He's where I would prefer to go. He has been banged up at times this year, but he's come back healthy. And their last game was not very competitive. So Ezukama is somebody I think we can buy low on 6,500 if you're stacking Columbi. Wisconsin, Purdue, a game with a 40-point total, which leaves a ton to be desired. Wisconsin is a 3-point favorite here. Purdue has played very strong defense. They're coming off that upset win over Iowa. Wisconsin's plays per game is bolstered by that very, very weird Penn State game where Wisconsin was over 90 plays per game. They're typically extremely slow and run heavy, so expect negative regression in play volume here. Graham Mertz is one of the worst quarterbacks in the country, negative rushing yards, not even averaging 150 pass yards. You just can't play Graham Mertz at any point in time. The running backs, it used to be Chez Mellusi all to himself, but it is now a 50-50 timeshare between Mellusi, the Clemson transfer, and freshman Braylon Allen, who's emerged in recent weeks. They each had 16 carries last week, and Braylon Allen just ran circles around Chez Mellusi, so expect more Braylon Allen moving forward. Again, Purdue has good defense overall, but Wisconsin's just going to run so many raw running plays that Braylon Allen should be considered. Mellusi just GPP viable. The receivers for Wisconsin are typically never strong plays. Kendrick Pryor leads the team in targets. Danny Davis leads the team in receiving. Jake Ferguson's a huge red zone weapon. Unless Wisconsin is significantly trailing, they do not see enough target volume worth considering. Right now, Kendrick Pryor averaging 36 receiving yards per game to Danny Davis's 40. Just bad plays overall. For Purdue, you have Aiden O'Connell taking over as signal caller. He's basically a carbon copy of Jack Plummer. Neither can run. They do benefit from an extremely fast and extremely pass-heavy Purdue offense, so sometimes they can backdoor their way into 300-yard games. We've seen that with O'Connell at times this year. He's actually been over 300 yards in back-to-back games, but this will be a very different matchup for him. Wisconsin's defense is good. If you play O'Connell, you're just hoping the backdoor for 300 yards is viable based on just raw opportunities. In the run game, Xander Horvath is still out. King Doru has usurped Dylan Downing as the pure lead back here. He's had 22 and 18 carries in back-to-back weeks, active as a pass catcher. He has 15 targets on the year, most of that coming in just 2 games. So in bad game scripts, Doru will be extremely active as a pass catcher. 4,900, he's basically the cheapest bell cow back on the slate. Not efficient, and Wisconsin's defense is good, but if you're just looking to save salary, he could make sense. In the receiving room, David Bell's the wide receiver 1, very clearly so, over 10 targets in each of his last 3 games, 20% target share. On Purdue, because of how many plays they run, that is massive target volume. He's averaging over 10 targets per game and over 130 receiving yards. Payne Durham is tied for second on the team in targets. That is with Milton Wright. Durham is the tight end. Wright is the wide receiver 2. Wright holds a slight target edge in the last 4 games and a slight receiving yardage edge. And Jackson Anthrop has been the wide receiver 3. Splitting time back there, you'll see TJ Sheffield, Brock Thompson. All these guys are active to some degree. So I'm trying to focus my focus here is going to be on David Bell, Payne Durham, and Milton Wright. Oregon taking on UCLA, 59-point total. Pretty healthy here for a Pac-12 game with 2 teams that like to run the ball. UCLA is a 2.5-point favorite. You see defensive weaknesses through the air for both of these teams, which will be kind of tough to exploit because these are 2 very, very ground-centric teams. Oregon's running about league average plays per game, passing just 41% of the time. Again, the best matchup comes through the air, but Anthony Brown is a game manager, dual threat quarterback. 242 yards on the ground is solid for him. But at his price, 7,900, you're just hoping for a little bit more through the air, and he doesn't even average 200 passing yards. So it's tough to get to Anthony Brown. In the run game, CJ Verdell went down. So Travis Dye has emerged as full feature back for Oregon. 21 and 18 touches in back-to-back games. Efficient on the ground with 88.3 rushing yards, 24.8 yards through the air on just 16.2 touches. And again, that's increased without Verdell. So Dye still very, very much in play despite a tougher matchup. And through the air, Jalen Red is the preferred option for Oregon. Johnny Johnson's route rate has dropped below 30%. So even though he leads the team in targets, he's not seeing as much opportunity. It's Red as the wide receiver 1 based on targets and routes, followed by Devin Williams and Micah Pittman, neither of whom have a ton of targets this year. And Chris Hudson still involved, making this a nasty receiver rotation. If you're stacking Brown, it's just Red and move on, in my opinion, outside of tournaments. For UCLA, you also have a dual threat quarterback in Dorian Thompson-Robinson, slightly more expensive than Anthony Brown, but he just offers more on the ground. 329 yards there, 200 pass yards per game. Volume hasn't been there for Dorian Thompson-Robinson, but they've been in a lot of positive game scripts, and he is more involved as a rusher, making him somewhat more viable than Anthony Brown. In the actual running backfield, Zach Charbonnet has moved well ahead of Britton Brown in terms of opportunities. He's been above 21 in each of the last five games now, 17.6 touches per game, 102 rushing yards. Charbonnet is a back worth targeting here as a slight favorite against Oregon. 7K flat is just too cheap for him. Kyle Phillips, he returned to practice on Monday after missing their most recent game. He's the wide receiver 1, and Greg Dulcich, the tight end, is technically the wide receiver 2. They exploit the better matchup here. Again, Oregon allowing nearly 300 passing yards per game, but it's just UCLA is only throwing the ball 38% of the time. So unless it's very competitive or they get down in games, what kind of ceiling do these players have? I would be more interested in Dulcich at his price, $4,800, than Kyle Phillips at $61. Some people may be interested in ancillary options for UCLA, but they are rotating Chase Cotta, Cam Brown, Casimir Allen, even Josiah Norwood and Logan Loya. They're just in a nasty rotation for wide receiver 3. And I know Casimir Allen's listed as an RB, but he's playing receiver for this team. So just complete disaster behind Dulcich and Phillips. Hard to target anybody. Next game, we have Oklahoma State taking on Iowa State. Interesting to see Iowa State 7-point favorite here over an undefeated Oklahoma State team, but that's what you get with the schedule Oklahoma State has played. Their only real win coming against Texas, but they're very fast, 77 plays per game. Pass rate is just 35%. They're starting to hit their stride a little bit after battling a ton of injuries to start the year, but they are going to be facing an elite Iowa defense. Sanders is very mobile, 216 yards on the ground, but he's been very limited as a passer this year, and that's been a staple of his career. He will pop up for 300-yard games on occasion, and he has one of them this year, but that occurred against Kansas State, and he hasn't eclipsed 200 yards in any other game this year. So Sanders, just pure GPP volume. In the run game, LD Brown and Desmond Jackson continue to battle injuries, which has thrust Utah State transfer Jalen Warren into one of the most voluminous roles in college football. He's been over 30 touches in each of the last 4 games, easily averaging 117 yards on the ground, also very active as a pass catcher. Jalen Warren, another 21 yards there. He's just so involved that the matchup doesn't make a huge difference for him. You can play Warren anytime you'd like. He's just a bit expensive. And now that we've had some injuries to receivers, there is a very clear pecking order. Devontavian Martin is the wide receiver 1, averaging 10.3 targets per game over their last 3. Behind him, Brennan Presley and Rashad Owens are each playing over 90% of the routes. Rashad Owens is more targeted than Brennan Presley in their last 4 games, 5.3 to 3.3, and he's cheaper, so he would be the preferred punt play, but most of the targets are going to Martin, with Owens and Presley being distant wide receiver 2s and 3s. For Iowa State, they're going to be facing a strong Oklahoma State defense. Brock Purdy's played very well this year. He's just dealing with very limited opportunities. 26 attempts per game, 227 yards. He is mobile, but he needs volume to really get there, which he hasn't seen. This is a competitive game, so it could happen. Purdy, he's completing 67% of his passes for 8.5 yards per attempt. So volume is very much the issue here, and he could be sneaky if volume comes. The run game, Breece Hall, his volume isn't very much different than Jalen Warren's, but he's extremely expensive at $9,400. With Breece Hall, you're falling back on the fact that he's a 7-point favorite, whereas Jalen Warren's a 7-point underdog. But still, Breece Hall, most of his volume coming as a rusher, averaging 26.3 opportunities per game. If you can afford him, he's fine. Just a lot of opportunity cost in the price. In the receiving room, it's Xavier Hutchinson. It's Charlie Kolar. Hutchinson's more efficient. He's more targeted, but Kolar, he's been more involved of late. Both are fine plays. Kolar's cheaper, so he's somebody I think is more palatable in terms of price. But ultimately, they're going to need a very competitive game to hit a ceiling game in terms of targets. Darren Wilson's the wide receiver 2 based on routes, but he's only seen 5 targets this year. Noel, Milton, they run 2 tight ends a lot. they just kind of cannibalize each other behind Hutchinson and Kohler. LSU Ole Miss, a 75.5 total, which has come down based on some injury news. 9-point spread in favor of Ole Miss. You have LSU trying to play fast, but dealing with a lot of inefficiency. Very pass heavy, 56%. That's dropped a ton in recent weeks. They only pass about 35% of the time in their most recent game, which we'll get to when we talk about Davis Price. Max Johnson, their quarterback, is mobile, 44 yards on the ground this year. And he's been benefiting a ton early in the year, at least, from heavy pass volume. 35 attempts per game, 265 yards. But again, that's plummeted in recent weeks, and he does depend on this volume to get there. So right now, Johnson, he's somebody that if he doesn't get the pass volume, it's going to be very hard for him to get there. He's risky, but if this game is competitive and Ole Miss is winning, as that projects to be the case here, I think he's a buy low. In the run game, Tyrion Davis-Price, 22 carries, 36 carries in their last 2 games. No targets in that span, so it's coming purely on the ground, but he still leads the running back room in overall targets. He's a buy. He's becoming more expensive, but he's still maybe a buy low because of what we saw early in the year for him. If he continues to see this kind of work, he's too cheap for his price. And Ole Miss allows over 200 rush yards per game. He's a risky play, but he's still viable. In the receiving room, Kayshon Boutte is still out. He's out for the year. So we did see their receiving room narrow a little bit. Brian Thomas, Malik Neighbors, and Jere Jenkins all played over 70% of the routes. Thomas had upside for a lot more, but he got hurt in the third quarter. Questionable for this game, so watch his status. But Neighbors actually led the team in targets with 6. Shows you a lot how much they embrace the run. And Jere Jenkins caught multiple touchdowns on just 4 targets. He's too expensive at $5,700. Would rather just play Neighbors or Thomas. Jack Betch, their hybrid tight end receiver, he only saw 62% of the routes, and his targets dropped from 19 combined in the previous 2 games down to 3. Not sure what to make of his role, but he should bounce back at some point. Still expensive to the point where I'd prefer to get Thomas and Neighbors with the inconsistent role so far. On Ole Miss, Matt Corral is banged up, and based on what Lane Kiffin said, doesn't seem like there's a great chance he plays. He's very banged up after carrying the ball 30 times last week against Tennessee. But Corral, 450 yards on the ground, nearly 300 through the air. He's super efficient, so if he plays, strong consideration in a 40-point implied team total environment for Ole Miss. On the ground, Jaron Ely returned to render this a 3-way committee with Henry Parrish, Snoop Connor, and Ely himself. Parrish is the preferred pass-catching back, but Connor's been very efficient lately. It's tough to trust this backfield when it's 3 players, and we even saw Corral take so much of the work that it's really hard to get to one of them. Before we move on from quarterback, if Corral sits, Kinkad Dent projects to be the starter. We have no sample with him, but he was recruited as a pro-style quarterback. He's big, maybe has some rushing ability. You'd play him based purely on the fact that he's operating the Ole Miss offense. We really don't know anything about him. In the receiving core, and he's an excellent play on FanDuel if he plays because the price is just ridiculous. And maybe you see Luke Altmaier. It's a situation to monitor. We're not really sure what Ole Miss would do. Maybe they even use some John Rice Plumlee. We'll see. In the receiving room, Dontario Drummond's the wide receiver 1, but they've severely depressed their play volume in terms of pass rate in recent weeks. They're only passing the ball about 40% of the time. That's reflected in all these targets. Dontario Drummond's down to just 5.3 targets per game in their last 4 contests, 88.5 receiving yards. So he's been efficient, but the volume's dropped. And now you have Jonathan Mingo out. Braylon Sanders is questionable. He left in the first quarter and didn't return. So maybe on the wrong side of questionable here. Where does this Ole Miss team turn to? So Drummond's locked in. From there, Ja'Cour Pearson ran a route on over 80% of dropbacks, 5 targets for him. He's your 3,200 pure punt play, ridiculously cheap. And then they actually used Danish Jackson over Jaden Jackson as the wide receiver 3. He ran a route on over 70% of dropbacks. So Danis, he's in play too. Just Pearson being cheaper, he's the guy you'd look to. Clemson taking on Pitt. 3-point spread in favor of Pitt. 47.5 total, very low overall. Clemson just a shell of themselves this year, still passing 50% of the time, but plays per game has plummeted all the way to 65 as they have no semblance of efficiency. DJ Uiagalelei has been one of the worst quarterbacks in the Power 5. He is mobile, which he has going for him, but he's only eclipsed 200 yards passing in 1 of 6 games. Pitt, they can be beat through the air, but this is still a very good defense, and Uiagalelei has struggled in worse spots. In the run game, we might get back Will Shipley, who's questionable for the game. He's missed the last 2, but he benefited from the bye. He would likely form some form of committee with Kobe Pace and fellow freshman Phil Maffa. It would be a three-way committee in a situation where Pitt is only allowing 100 rushing yards per game. Tough to trust anybody here. If Shipley's out, Pace and Maffa would have more viability, but still very tough matchup. The receiving room, it's Justin Ross as the wide receiver 1 very clearly. He's out-targeted Joseph Nada. In all 3 of the games, he played a full complement of snaps. The 2-target game you see there, he was out with injury. Nada is the wide receiver 2, and pretty clearly, he's been very efficient and actually has more receiving yards than Ross. Those are the 2 clear options here. Then you have some injuries to monitor. So Frank Ladsen's been out with an injury, not expecting him to come back, but if he does, that would probably render Bo Collins a timeshare player who's been the wide receiver 3 in his place. Davis Allen, their tight end, popped up for 8 targets in their last game, but he was only playing so much because we had Braden Galloway out with an injury, and it's a concussion. So maybe Galloway comes back and renders this a timeshare too. I think you play Ross or Nada in contrarian builds. Otherwise, you probably ignore Clemson. For Pittsburgh, Kenny Pickett's been fantastic, operating a high-volume Pitt passing attack, which has a 50% pass rate, 78.5 plays per game. Pickett's mobile. He's averaging 322 yards per game on 34 attempts. Clemson's defense is still the strength of this team, and Pickett is a little bit expensive, but he's been so efficient. You could certainly take a stab on him in stacks. They would have to be tournaments for me, though, just with the low total in the game overall. He's also easy to stack. You have the Alpha and Jordan Addison, very expensive, but almost 100 yards per game for him on 8 targets. Taysier Mack is a solid consolation prize, 52 yards per game on nearly 6 targets. And outside of that, I think you can maybe play Krull, tight ends, and GPPs, but like Jared Wayne, Shockey Jacques-Louis, even Melquise Stovall are all rotating in as the wide receiver 3. It's Taysier as the punt and Matt Addison as the alpha. In the run game, they've significantly narrowed the backfield, which had seen upwards of 5 running backs involved. They've only been using 2 in recent weeks. Israel Abanikanda, and Vincent Davis. And Abanikanda has firmly moved ahead of him, outcarried him in 3 straight games. Last week, it was 21 carries to 11, and he could be in line for even more work if he continues his efficiency down the stretch. He's a GPP play worth targeting. Last game, we have Maryland taking on Minnesota. Another semi-low total game, 54.5. This is kind of propped up by Maryland's bad defense. But overall, Minnesota is still only a 5-point favorite. They've been one of the most up and down teams this year, like playing Ohio State fairly close, losing a game to Bowling Green. Really tough to gauge this Minnesota team. Maryland has dealt with a ton of injuries. Talia Tagovailoa is cheap at $7K. He's averaging 35.5 attempts per game and 293 yards. He's just seeing so much volume that he needs to be considered at a cheaper price. And again, he's only been below 274 yards in 1 game. Minnesota plays good defense, but we've seen Tagovailoa play well in some really tough environments this year. You wish he was a little more mobile. He takes a lot of sacks and doesn't scramble as much, but he's certainly in play based on volume. Tayon Fleet Davis, he's seen a role reduction. Just they've had to pass so much in recent games. They'll rotate in Penny Boone, Isaiah Jacobs, Famatu. It's tough to target Tayon Fleet Davis in such a pass-heavy offense here. Receiving game, Dante Demas is out. Jayshon Jones is out. Raheem Jarrett's the clear wide receiver 1. Still easily led the team in routes, even though he only saw 2 targets. They rotated a bunch of pass catchers in as the 2 and 3. Daryl Jones, Brian Cobbs, Carlos Carrier, and Daryl Jones the most consistent so far this year, 3,600. He'd be the punt play to target. Chigo Conco is the tight end, seldom targeted. So it's Raheem Jarrett or Daryl Jones for me. On Minnesota, Tanner Morgan is a Graham Mertz type quarterback, not mobile, no upside in terms of passing. He's not somebody to target here. Their running backs, they run the ball so much, it's just very difficult to decipher right now after losing Muhammad Ibrahim and Trey Potts. Marquise Irving was banged up heading into the last game, and he still handled 7 carries, but he's their 4-star freshman. If he's healthier, maybe you see more work out of him. But the real story here is Bryce Williams playing as efficient as he was, went over 100 yards, 17 carries for him. He has filled in the past. A couple of years ago, he had a couple 20-plus carry games and played well in them. So Bryce Williams, with as well as he played last week, he could be in line for that Trey Potts role. We'll just have to see it. He did split time with Irving and Kai Thomas, but his performance was noteworthy. Bryce Williams is the preferred play in the run game. Among receivers, we didn't see Daniel Jackson last week, and PJ Fleck is one of the worst coaches with injuries. He just doesn't update them. So you don't know if Daniel Jackson's going to play. You'll have to wait till pregame to see if he warms up. But either way, Chris Ottman-Bell's the wide receiver 1, 12 targets for him. Typically, they're not going to be that high unless very competitive games. And Mike Brown-Stevens has emerged as the wide receiver 2. He's somebody that is probably not worth a look. Both these guys are expensive for their roles. And for me, it's just going to be Bryce Williams or move on for this Minnesota team. But that'll do it for us today. Thank you guys for watching. If you have a favorite play on the slate, let me know in the comment section. Would love to hear it. I'm Matt Gajewski on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. Hit the thumbs up button on the way out. But thank you guys for watching. We will catch you again next.